All right, some show notes from the Rooster podcast, Season 2, Episode 1, where I had Professor Todd McGowan on. Of course, I'm going to put a link to the entire discussion. Really enjoyed the discussion in the description of this video, along with the book that I read and that we discussed in the video. Professor Todd McGowan, he teaches film and critical theory at the University of Vermont. His book, Enjoyment, Left and Right, we talked about it, how it relates to contemporary contradictions in the political discourse. I explained or shared with him kind of my exploration of Lacanian psychoanalysis, Lacanian theory, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And then we got into Todd's background, his upbringing, his childhood, what it was like in high school. And he talked about being brought up, and I found this interesting, in a fundamentalist Christian household. And he talked about some of the traumatic experiences he had, but ultimately said his parents were great despite kind of the radical religious views. And then the conversation kind of kicked off. We discussed the idea of the basic cultural codes that are necessary to build civilization. And I brought up the Ten Commandments, and we used them as an example. I brought them forth as an example of a set of basic rules that can serve as a bedrock of civilization rather than an archaic, superstitious, prohibitory rules from God from on high, right? So how can we reorient and look at something like the Ten Commandments in a different way? We talked about the first two commandments in detail, with the idea that they are about not setting up symbolic structures or idols. They're actually the antithesis of that, that obscure the concept of God as the fundamental absence, or the real, from a Lacanian perspective. We talked about Slavoj Žižek, his Christian atheism, and we discussed our perspectives on it. And then this part of the conversation ended with the idea of the imperceptibility of God, which comes down in the finger of Christ, and that which is present in every person. Then we got into epistemology. We discussed the idea of how can we understand from a psychoanalytical perspective the eating from the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, how we can come back to that fractally, and eating from the fruit, which ultimately leads to things falling apart. We discussed how humans cannot appropriate good and evil from a biblical perspective due to the lack of spiritual maturity. We brought up how there were two trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. It was fundamentally Adam and Eve's dispensation, and therefore humanity's dispensation, to eventually eat from the tree, from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, when certain maturity was obtained. We talked about the symbolic order, how the symbolic order is necessary, but it is inherently fallen, was the point that I made, and Todd pushed back a bit there. We talked about Lacan's theory of the split subject and sin as missing the mark, and how that idea resonated with me. We talked about the goal of psychoanalysis, according to Lacan, is to come to terms, and this was an important theme throughout the discussion, come to terms with the fact that one is lacking, and to find a way to deal with this lack rather than trying to escape it. Embracing contradiction, and this was a key theme, key term that we kind of dove deep on, and I want to continue diving deep on. Embracing contradiction rather than trying to resolve it is seen as a way to avoid sin. We also mentioned how Christ is a figure who embodies contradiction, and following him means embracing it rather than trying to escape it. Of course, we go into more detail. In the next part of the conversation, we talked about the concepts of bliss and trauma in relation to spiritual and religious experiences. We explored the idea that the transformation or transfiguration that occurs through religious experiences can be traumatic, as it uproots one's symbolic identity, but that it's necessary for the transformation to happen. We also touched on the role of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in dealing with trauma, and the work that needs to be done through the contradiction that is again central to human identity. We highlight the importance of accepting one's passions and working through them over time to reorient one's psyche and reorient one's relationships with oneself and with one's community. We then contrasted the ideas of Kant and Hegel, with Kant emphasizing constant progression towards flourishing, while Hegel's idea is the more enjoyment one gets, the more jouissance one gets, the more conflict arises. Then we reflect on how conversations like these have a certain quality to them, and that this quality can shift over time. And we talked about how both psychoanalysis and orthodoxy, we worried about, or I discussed about how I was worried about even making something like orthodoxy, which is the religion of my ancestors and one that I am embedded in, how one can even make something like that into a spiritual delusion. And we talked about prelest, and the importance of being mindful of investing one's identity in something like psychoanalysis, something like orthodoxy, and to have that identity pop and burst as the delusion and the ideology loses its grip as you form into another ideology, and the dangers of doing so. Then we talked about the role of the other with regards to rooting one in reality and kind of combating the pull of the hyperreal and of the simulation. So the importance of differentiating the imaginary from a Lacanian perspective versus the real. As when someone is in a psychotic position, right, they only relate to others as imaginary, so they only relate to imaginary others. So projections, a projection of what the other is in one's mind, one's psyche, you don't really relate with actual people. And the important distinction of the personhood that is kind of championed in orthodoxy was discussed. And the encounter with the other provides a, quote, rock of the real that resists what one tries to impose on it. We emphasize the importance of doubting one's projects and engaging in self-critique. And as an example, we came back to the Ten Commandments, how they can be used as kind of measures or signposts for one's actions and thoughts, such as checking if one feels a ping of jealousy at one's neighbors. The whole keeping up with the Joneses, is that something that pops up in your psyche and your consciousness as, let's say, your neighbor gets a new car or a new boat or a new fence, whatever it might be, and things of that nature. And we discussed about the importance of telling the truth, and we noted that lying kind of may be necessary in certain contexts, but it's important, the intention and the role of deception in being truthful versus lying, and to be aware of when lies come up, in a sense. And finally, we discussed the kind of fundamental sensibility of making sense of the world and critiques of the West of being logocentric. And we delved into the history of human sacrifice. We delved into the kind of the effect in wrestling with Christianity, personally, how I have been in the last few years. And we talked about how the story of Abraham and Isaac in the context of human sacrifice in various cultures and religion. I suggested that Christianity is not only, I reflected the Orthodox position that Christianity is not the only truth, right? But it is the fulfillment of the truth. And we discussed again the role of sacrifice and its transformation in Christian theology. And I finally concluded again that wrestling with Christianity, with the impact of Christianity on the world and on the self, is a profound and ongoing journey. And we ended the conversation there. So please take a look. Let me know what you think. Again, I'll put the links in the description here, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, join my Patreon. And until next time, God bless, guys.